On today's Locked On Jayhawks, we do the impossible task of trying to figure out the starting lineup and rotation projections for this year's KU basketball team.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio, and this is Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for making LOJ your first listen every day. Thank you to Everydayers, catching each and every show. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also find us on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe. We're going to be breaking down our rotation projections, our starting lineup projections, how deep could this KU roster go for KU, and also get into a little bit of recruiting news. KU football lands a quarterback for 2026 in on a couple of receivers. Darryn Peterson going to be announcing later tonight as well, if you're listening to this on your Friday morning. First, this episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. All right, so we're going to start with the rotation. And before we get into this, I want to clarify, this is the rotation that I am projecting, I guess, for the majority of it. It's difficult because you can have a beginning season rotation, an end of season rotation, a middle of the season rotation. There's so many ways you can go about this. And it's also difficult because this year's KU team has shown several players who have looked really good early in the season, or you've heard good things about, or have had different moments. Tough to figure out who's going to be higher up in the pecking order. And also certain players who we thought were going to have bigger roles maybe haven't performed to the notion we thought they would to this point. And where do they go in the pecking order? I'll add this little caveat here. If I'm predicting the opening night starting five, which I still don't even feel great about this, I'm going to predict Dajuan Harris. I'm going to predict Coit at 19 points. Going to be tough not to start him. I'm going to predict Zeke Mayo into the starting lineup for AJ Stor. So you're playing like three guards next to each other. And then KJ Adams, Hunter Dickinson. That'll be my starting five projection for KU. But you could convince me that Rylan Griffin starts instead of Zeke Mayo, or that Rylan Griffin starts with Zeke Mayo and Coit goes to the bench. It's a lot of big questions that are kind of in the air. I will also say, as part of these rotations, I typically am one of the biggest champions of, like, you go every offseason and you look at every player and you're like, oh, but I like that guy and I like that guy and he's a good pedigree or he was a highly rated recruit, and you talk yourself into every single player playing, and it just doesn't happen. And typically Bill Self teams only play, really a 7-man rotation where the eighth guy is kind of like spot minutes or like a limited role. Maybe in the regular season or the non-conference, it's 8 guys with a 9th man in the spot role. But there are certain precedents that have been set. And if you're an everydayer, you caught a rotation episode earlier this offseason, and we looked back at that 2010 to 2011 Kansas basketball team. That was the Morris twin team that went 35-3. It was obviously a great team that ended up getting upset in the Elite Eight by VCU. But you look at the minutes per game, that team had 10 players who played 10 or more minutes per game. Now you could say, well, Travis Relaford, who played 10.4 minutes per game, he only played 29 games of the 38. So in a sense, was he really part of the rotation? I don't know. He also started 3 games, though, which is pretty crazy. So they Travis Relaford, Mario Little, Elijah Johnson, T-Rob, Josh Selby, Morris twins, Tyshawn Taylor, Brady Morningstar, Tyrell Reed. All of them played over 10 minutes per game. Nobody played more than 29 minutes per game. So I'm going to actually predict that it's going to be closer to that one, and I can't wait to be horribly wrong. All right, so if you're watching on YouTube, we have a graphic out. And again, this is probably going to be horribly wrong. This is the least confident that I have ever felt at this point of the season or going into a season about where things would be, right? And I mean, not to say that I haven't been wrong before and won't be wrong again, because that's absolutely true with some of this stuff I'm predicting, but at least a lot of times you can get into the ballpark with certain stuff. This one felt like throwing a lot of darts. Dajuan Harris starting, like, that's okay. I feel great about that, but how many minutes is he going to play, right? And I know there's probably going to be some people in the comments being like, oh, they should start Coit or Zeke Mayo and take away. Guys, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. You can argue if you think it's better or why you think it doesn't matter what you think. Bill Self is not going to not start Dajuan Harris. Dajuan Harris has 29 minutes per game on this. And again, you could convince me it's going to be 32 because it's Bill Self with a 6th-year point guard. Those guys typically play a lot of minutes. You could convince me it's going to be lower at 26 because of all the guard competition they have. But the thing with Dajuan Harris is I go back to that 2021 to 22 championship season. They had a good other point guard option that they could go to with Remy Martin. He played 29 minutes that year. And that was even with Remy having, I guess, the injury and whatever weird stuff was going on behind the scenes over the course of that season. If Remy would have been playing the whole way through, does Dajuan end up closer to 26, 27 minutes per game? So I went with 29 on Dajuan, but I don't feel great about it either way. For the rest of the backup point guard minutes, I gave some of those minutes to Shakeel Moore. I also gave the rest of those minutes to David Coit, so both them getting some point guard minutes. As far as the starting two guard, I got Zeke Mayo starting at the 2. And again, this is not my opening night starter necessarily, just over the course of the season. Now, with Zeke, it's interesting because you go back to the comments by Bill Self after the Washburn game that the reason he went to the bench after starting in the Arkansas game was because Zeke wasn't shooting enough in practice, and Bill Self wanted to get his attention. Well, he got his attention, and it worked out off the bench. So there's 2 avenues Bill Self could view that. He could view it as, hey, it got Zeke Mayo's attention having to come off the bench. Is that the best place for him? Would it be good for him to be that 6-man role that can come off the bench and just be firing? Or does he view it as, okay, he listened to me, message received, now I'll put him back in the starting lineup. I went back in the starting lineup here. I have him playing 24 minutes per game as both the 2 and then a little bit of minutes at the 3. When KU is like, hey, we want to play Dajuan next to David Coit and Zeke Mayo, or Dajuan next to Shakeel Moore and Zeke Mayo, when they do those 3-guard lineups, which we did see a little bit in the Washburn game. I have Rylan Griffin starting at 3 over AJ Stor. Now, you could argue that by end of season, it would best behoove Kansas that AJ Stor is a starter because that would probably mean he's playing well. But what happens if Rylan Griffin's playing well and then AJ Stor starts playing well later in the season, but your team is doing really well? Maybe you just stick with the groove. I don't know. But with Rylan Griffin, I have 24 minutes per game. And with Zeke, you could convince me 20 minutes per game, right? Like, what if the athleticism doesn't translate? I don't know. You could convince me 30 minutes per game if he's one of the team's leading scorer. Same goes for like Rylan Griffin, right? I have KJ starting at the 4, 27 minutes per game for KJ. Now, the thing with that is you look at some of the exhibition minutes for KJ, and he's like leading KU in minutes played in those. So what does that mean? Does that mean KJ is going to actually play more this year? Or is it a fact that Hunter Dickinson was out? So KJ was not only logging minutes at the 4, he was logging some minutes as a backup 5. He's not going to get that when Hunter's back because you're going to have Hunter and Flory cannibalizing all of those. So I have KJ at 27 minutes. And then I have Hunter Dickinson at 28. Bill Self said that, he wanted to get Dajuan, KJ, and Hunter to around 30 or under minutes per game. Boom, we accomplished that here. Now, off the bench, we have AJ Stor, 24 minutes per game. And as you can tell, with Zeke Mayo, Rylan Griffin, AJ Stor, all at 24 minutes per game. A little bit of that is a guess to where it's like those are interchangeable and you could interchange like who's starting where if they're playing the same minutes per game. And a little of that was on purpose because it is hedging the bet a little bit in terms of, I don't know. This is a very hard one to figure out this year. I have David Coit playing 15 minutes, some at the 1 and some as the backup 2. And that's another one where it's like, okay, he just looked so good against Washburn. Could he play 20 minutes per game? Could he play 25 minutes per game? Maybe it's not crazy. Or am I overvaluing a game against a Division II school where he looked really good? And in reality, the start against Washburn was a little bit of a nod by Bill Self to say, hey, we appreciate you coming here. We appreciate your hard work. You're going to have a chance to do something. But once we get to game time, you're going to play the Jalen Coleman-Lands role of more playing like spot minutes, 10 minutes per game. If you have the hot hand that day, maybe you play a little bit more. If you don't, you're going to play a little bit less. That's entirely possible too. But that one game certainly shadowing my judgment a little. So he's got 15 minutes there. Flory, just plug him in for whatever minutes you don't want to save. If you think Hunter plays 26, boom, that's 14 for Flory. If you think he plays 30, that's 10 for Flory. I have Hunter at 28, so 12 for Flory. And then Shakeel Moore with 10 minutes. That's one where it's like, if he would have never got hurt, you could convince me he would be ahead of Zeke and David Coit in terms of the minutes or to start. Maybe Zeke would still be in front of it, but you're certainly in front of David Coit. And we hear Bill Self talking about the defense. He loves defense. Now, does Shakeel Moore end up, usurping one of these guys? Does the injury put him behind the 8 ball? I don't know, but we gave him 10 minutes per game, which is a little similar to the comp we had earlier in the offseason, talking about, maybe he plays a Roderick Stewart role, where he's like this 9th guy, like extra guard who plays 11, 12 minutes per game off the bench as a guard who's athletic. So Shakeel Moore, 10 minutes per game. You could convince me that and David Coit swap. Again, Don't feel great about these, but these are trying to ballpark at least. And then Marquise Passmore, 8 minutes per game. Huge wild card because he played like the same amount of minutes in the 2 exhibition games combined as AJ Stor did. So, like, who's to say Marquise Passmore can't play 20 minutes per game? And then if that happens, where are you shaving off minutes? And that becomes the most difficult part of all this. You might look at one of these players on this list or that I've talked about and be like, that guy's going to play way more than that, right? He's you have him marked for 24, 15. He's going to play 25. He's going to play 30. Okay, if you do that, where are the minutes coming away? And I do find it very interesting of how much Marquise Passmore has played and that he got in the second half of the Washburn game with all starters around him at one point. Now, was that just Bill Self trying to get some early season reps for a young freshman? Or was there something indicative of that? So that's what we have here. Again, a lot of this is probably going to be wrong because I don't feel confident in it as much as many other years to begin with. But this was my I felt a lot better about this in the offseason than I did right now before the season starts. So let's get to the biggest questions or things that could change some of this stuff. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Our episode today is brought to you by 5 Hour Energy, and our friends over at 5 Hour Energy know that being a passionate football fan isn't just a hobby, it's a way of life. It takes a lot of energy to power through all-day tailgates, touchdown celebrations, or an agonizing second overtime, which is why they've created Stand the Fan 5 Hour Energy Shots with a special flavor called Fan Fuel, the energy shot made just for super fans like us, the fans who are first in the parking lot and who are the last to leave. We see you. You know what else might have given you a little bit of Jayhawk fan fuel this week? The moment was Savion Morrison took a 3rd and long touchdown early in the game against K-State. We don't need to talk about how the game finished, but early in the game, that got you hyped, that got you energized. 5 Hour Energy knows that no matter what team you root for, being a fan requires heart, soul, and a whole lot of energy. Whether you're prepping for the big tailgate or ironing your jersey, your game day to-do list is always a mile long. That's why the limited edition Stand the Fan 5 Hour Energy Shot is here to help you keep fueled throughout the season and the day. What's your fan fuel this week? Whatever it is, do it with a 5 Hour Energy. Available on 5hourenergy.com, shipped nationwide. Now, continuing on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks, and thanks for making it your first listen. You can check out Locked On College Basketball, Locked On College Football for your second listen every day, Locked On Big 12 as well with what's going on there. So what are some of the biggest questions that could change our early rotation projections? Well, I think one big one into all of this, and a lot of these are going to revolve around the guards, like how good is Shakeel Moore going to be? And I don't just mean in terms of the player himself, but like also coming off the injury and trying to catch back up. And I think also when you look at it, like, does missing some of these practices and some of these early game opportunities, does it put him behind the 8 ball to where, you know, normally him and David Coit would be a very close competition, but those extra reps that Coit has makes it too tough to overcome? I don't know. Like, that's going to be a part of it because you could convince me that maybe it's later in the year, right? If one of the questions is the defense for Zeke Mayo and David Coit, is there a game where some opposing guards are constantly getting past those guys and Bill Self throws Shakeel Moore out there and all of a sudden he's able to limit the ball pressure and that endears Bill Self enough that that is the runway for him starting to get more playing time? And do we end up seeing Shakeel Moore more than him, right? That's a big question. That could certainly change things. Will David Coit translate playing against bigger teams, right? I mean, David Coit is not an overly large guy. And so if it's one thing, like I said, am I overreacting to a really good performance against a Division II school, right? I mean, what happens when David Coit goes up against bigger guards? We saw the Arkansas game, he was 0 for 5. You know, what happens over the course of the season when you're playing bigger guards, more athletic guards over the course of the Big 12? And if it doesn't translate, then maybe you are seeing more spot minutes for David Coit, and that's somebody you could drop minutes and divvy out some of those minutes to other places. But what if it does translate? What if he is that defender who's at least being pesky and guarding guys 94 up the feet and 94 feet up the court, and he's hitting threes and making extra passes, giving you an extra ball handler and quickness on the court? Then maybe he's playing more, right? Then with Zeke Mayo, like, same question, except instead of against bigger teams, how's he going to translate against more athletic teams? Again, he struggled a little bit more against Arkansas. Now, you can point back to for David Coit and Zeke Mayo, did they struggle versus Arkansas because that was just a good team? It was on the road, it was their first game, still figuring stuff out. You're still without, you know, Rylan Griffin and Hunter Dickinson and some of these things that is going to make life easier for you. Or was that a real flaw that we'll see later in the season against better teams, right? Those are the real questions. that could swing some of the minutes pretty sizably for each of those individuals. And then if the minutes is going down for any of them, it's minutes up for other players. If the minutes going up for one of them, it's minutes down for somebody else. And I think in that same relation, like, does one of those three players by far end up being the best player? Right now we have them combined for like 49 minutes played in our projections. But what happens if like Bill Self is like, no, this guy's by far the best of those three. He's going to play 30 minutes a night. The second best is going to play like the other 19. And then the third guy's just not in the rotation. Like, that could happen too, right? Or do they all end up being pretty equal where they're all playing around the same minutes per game? The other part of this is like, what are you getting from AJ Stor? If it's the AJ Stor we saw early in the season, or in the first two exhibitions, I should say, he's still going to get good minutes because Bill Self wants to figure him out, because the highest ceiling version, the highest potential version of this team involves AJ Stor being a key contributor, being a good player on this year's team and trying to unlock that, trying to figure that out. So is it going to be like, how long is that going to last? I guess, how long is the leash going to be? How many minutes are we talking while you're figuring that stuff out? Like, those are the real questions that kind of come down to this and really make it interesting. And then at what point do you pull the Band-Aid, pull the ripcord, so to speak, to where it's like, hey, this ain't working. It's time to give your minutes to Marquise Passmore or whatever it ends up being, right? Like, that's another big question. Then the final big question here is, how much does Self really drain the minutes of Dajuan Harris, KJ Adams, Hunter Dickinson? Because he said he'd like to get those guys minutes closer to 30, under 30 per game. It's one thing for him to say it. It's another thing for him to do it, because I don't know, we see him go with the guys he trusts all the time. And especially early in the season, when you might be saying, hey, we have a higher ceiling if we can give this guy more reps early in the season, but we really got to win this game. He's going to go with guys he trusts. And so can he give that longer leash to those players that allowed Dajuan, KJ, and Hunter to play under 30 minutes per game, and give those other bench guys the opportunity to take advantage of that? There's a little bit of, I'll believe it when I see it, but he has said it, so that's why we projected it. But again, wouldn't surprise me if those guys all end up playing 30 minutes per game. All right, let's get some recruiting news. KU is a new quarterback in the class of 2026, and Darryn Peterson announces later tonight. This episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL and the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm finishing things up on this episode, and we will have a bonus episode if there's good news tonight and Darryn Peterson becomes a Jayhawk, and I guess we'll start right there with that recruiting news. So Darryn Peterson, top 5 recruit in the class. Combo guard. Seems like Kansas has been kind of the favorite for a while here, but sounds like there's been some late push from some other schools that makes it an interesting decision that'll happen at 8 o'clock tonight. Like I said, if there's good news, we will have a bonus show for that. A lot of KU football news. Jaylen Mason, who is a quarterback in the class of 2026, local kid, originally from Mays. I think he goes to Wichita Northwest High School. Also had offers from Iowa State and Liberty. He is a 3-star in Rivals. He is a 3-star with On3, where he's an 88 graded, and he's the number 33 quarterback in the class at On3, which out of comparison, David McComb's number 32, Isaiah Marshall's number 30. I think a lot of KU fans think highly of both those quarterback recruits they have bringing in. So when you look at Jaylen Mason, you're looking at somebody who is right in that same range of players. The biggest difference, though, is that Jaylen Mason, class of 2026, that would make him still a junior in high school. So still a lot of time to improve and bounce that up even more before he ends up coming to college. Now, this is one where you might be thinking, hey, you have these good quarterback recruits already in tow. Why do you keep adding more? This is just business in college football. You bring in a quarterback every class. Some schools bring in 2. For KU, their rule typically is 1. And the reason why, you don't know with quarterback attrition. Quarterbacks transfer all the time, right? You don't know which ones are going to end up being good. You can think all these guys are going to be great, but players always don't live up to their recruiting ranking, especially at the quarterback position where there's so much asked of you. So you continue to add to it. And especially because it's like, if you're viewing Isaiah Marshall to the class of 2026, basically with Jaylen Mason, like you're talking about a 2-year difference to where, okay, by the time Jaylen Mason arrives on campus, Isaiah Marshall could be a redshirt sophomore, and he could be a year or two away from, moving on to the NFL if things were going super, super well. Although, that's a story for another day, because I don't know that Marshall has NFL size. We don't need to get into that right now. Nonetheless, I really love the KU quarterback room that they're bringing in, and all these guys. You don't know what's going to happen. What if the loser of the quarterback competition, if it comes down to Isaiah Marshall versus David McComb, what if the loser says, okay, well, since I lost the competition, I'm going to transfer away? Now you have Mason coming in and boom, but it seems like they're recruiting that position really well. One position they haven't recruited super well has been receiver, but it sounds like they're starting to make some moves on that. They are working to flip a receiver who's committed to Nebraska, who's kind of a local kid, so that would be big. And then also Jaden Nickens, who is a 4-star receiver. He's also a 2-sport player, would play basketball at KU as well. It sounds like there's some real KU interest and possibility there. That would be big time. Obviously, they need a good receiver. I mean, they're going to be losing all these good receivers in the offseason here. You need some receiver talent infused in. And if you get a 2-sport player out of it, obviously the scholarships are expanding in basketball to 15, although I'm not even sure you'd count in that, because I thought the NCAA rule was the scholarship that you count to for your sport is the first one you play. I think there was, like, back in the day, it was like Miami and Florida State were like taking advantage of it, and they would sign kids to track scholarships because they would be on the track team. They'd run like, sprints and stuff, but then they wouldn't have to count the scholarship to football. So they changed that rule where it's like your first sport that happens is the one that you're a part of, but that would actually make him only under scholarship for football, theoretically. But yeah, even if it was basketball too, even if you had to count for both, you have the extra scholarships next year anyway. And so, obviously, this would be pretty cool. And there's I wouldn't say super long lineage, but there's some really cool players who have played, 2 sports and had a lot of success. I mean, you think of like Ray Evans, you think of Charles Gordon, you think of James Sosinski, of course. Who could forget Big Game James? All right, that'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get podcasts, including on our YouTube page. Back tonight, if there's some good news on Darryn Peterson, with a bonus show for that. So make sure to subscribe to the show on YouTube and anywhere you get your podcast. See you next time with LOJ.